Hello, everybody. Welcome to Reflections on Music and Nature. I'm really happy to have with me Nell Shaw Cohen. She is a composer and multimedia artist based in Brooklyn and originally from San Francisco. She composes music that evokes landscapes and visual art and was recently commissioned by the Houston Grand Opera for a feminist rodeo opera called Turn and Burn. She's also the founder and director of Landscape Music, which is an international composers network and online publication which this series is associated with and which I also happen to be a member. Nell, thanks so much for taking the time for this. It's really nice to see you.
It's great to see you too, Ryan. Thanks so much for inviting me to be a part of this.
Absolutely. And well, we were talking a little bit about this earlier, but I'll start by asking you, how are you feeling these days? And what are you doing? Are you avoiding composing? Are you composing a little bit? I think this is a question a lot of us artistic people are, just having different approaches to these days.
Yeah, absolutely. I think at the very beginning of COVID, hitting my area, I'm here in Brooklyn, New York. I tried to sort of push through it and get a lot done on a project I was working on. And I quickly was feeling burnout, and I realized I had to pace myself because it was a marathon, not a sprint. So I have been able to be creative in quarantine, but it's come in little fits and bursts. And I found to just sort of like follow a natural rhythm. And some days I just can't do that kind of high focus work, and I need to do other kinds of things. And some days the inspiration will come and I can do something artistic. So yeah, I'm just taking it one day at a time and, trying to like maintain a healthy balance.
That's good. I think we all need to just listen to how we're feeling at this moment. Um, you sent me before this interview your artistic statement, which was which I actually found very interesting. You're very specific about the term landscape as it relates to music. And you draw a connection between landscape music and the idea of landscape painting, which is a kind of a very particular form in art. I'm wondering if you could tell me about that idea of landscape in your music, and how do you use music to convey what you're calling experience of place? Like, what does that mean, and how does that translate into sound?
Yeah, that's a really well put question. I guess there's a lot of different answers to that because it depends on the piece and the particular needs of a piece. And, as you mentioned, I'm really interested in landscape art and visual art in particular, as well as literature. And a lot of the pieces I create are, in some sense, interpretation of an artistic lens on landscape. So it's a sort of second level of landscape interpretation. So, for example, my orchestral piece inspired by Tom Killian's print of Point Reyes National Seashore. That was sort of informed both by the print itself, the artistic interpretation, which I have a picture of right behind
Oh,
me.
cool, great.
And also my own personal experiences of that place, which I've been to many times and have a very personal connection to. So I was looking at the visual characteristics of the composition of the artwork, as well as thinking about the more immediate, tangible, experiential qualities of being there. So like the feeling of the breeze on your skin, or the sun on your skin, or the sounds and the sights that you see in the place, and finding musical equivalents for them. So that, that's one angle that I take, but I also look at it through text. I write a lot of vocal music, and a lot of my vocal music is related to landscape or place in some sense. And that might be characters' personal experience of places and illuminating that through music. So it can be something as literal or direct as a particular melodic line responding to a feature of the landscape, like a particular shape of a tree or the particular color of the sky. But it might be something a little bit more removed and conceptual, like a character's reflection on what a place means to them, or the place as a sort of leitmotif through their story. So it's really varied, but I think just as a person, I'm really interested in landscape and place. And so I try as much to make my work as a composer reflect what I'm passionate about.
Great. Yeah, that's very well put. It sounds like you have a sort of way of generating musical material. We've talked about this with a lot of our other guests too. Like you're sort of drawing from these places and these experiences, and also other artistic works all together that are, and then responding to it through music. Do you have like any particular thoughts about what does the audience hear, or what do people take away from it, or is that kind of like besides the point? Or I don't know. I'm just curious about that aspect, because I think for us, we talk as composers a lot about our process, which is valuable and important, and then what happens to it later is like, I don't know.
Yeah, yeah, that's a really important question. I think that there's sort of two aspects to it for me. One is that the music in and of itself as an artistic expression, I think should have integrity and substance on its own. And I want listeners to bring their own experiences to the act of listening. And I think that's absolutely essential part of making and consuming the work. So I'm hoping that if I bring a lot of myself to the work and infuse it with, substance and texture, that people listening to it will draw their own meaning from it, which might be related but slightly different from what I had put into it. So it's kind of like a game of telephone, but as long as I give it something that sparks inspiration or an experience that's meaningful for someone, then that's a success. I think there's also a second layer of it for me, is that as a composer in the world, above and beyond the actual act of putting notes on the page, I'm really interested in music as a platform for education and advocacy and engaging with the world of ideas above and beyond music making. And landscape music is really a reflection of that, where we're using music as a way to talk about and engage with very specific ideas from the extra musical world. So a lot of my pieces do explicitly have a program or a narrative or an image that's associated with it. And I think that's intended certainly not to restrict the listener's experience of the music or to tell them this is what this music is supposed to mean, but more to give them a point of entry into engaging with a subject matter that might be new to them, or perhaps they hadn't considered in quite that way. So I think, it has to work on multiple levels for me to be something that I really want to pour my energies and my time into.
That makes sense. There's all these filters, right, that are happening. There's your own perception of these different things. There's the nature, and there are visual works, and then there's the process of composing, which we composers know is you don't know what's going to happen on the other side of a piece when you start it. So there's that filter. Then there's the filter of the audience, and there's the interaction of your description and program notes and associations that they make. And yeah, I think that's part of the fun of it. Is everyone has a different. Everyone will take something different, and like you said, you're helping also in a way to draw attention to certain things that people may not think about as much.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'm definitely thinking about an audience when I compose. I don't like to think of it as, making art in a vacuum. Like I'm making music in the context of a society and a culture and trying to speak to that society and culture in my own particular way.
Right. So as you're composing, do you have like a certain audience in mind for different pieces, or like how does your idea of the audience, because that's actually a really interesting question, because I really, I'm not really interested to take like necessarily a stand one way or the other myself, but there are, some people say like, oh, you shouldn't write for an audience. Some people say, oh no, you got to write for the audience. And not to put it in binary terms, but like when you're writing pieces, like how does the idea of the audience influence your process? And is that different for different pieces?
Oh yeah, that's really interesting. I think it is different for different pieces. And it's interesting when you say writing for an audience. I think it's almost impossible to do that completely, because we would have to make a lot of assumptions about what the audience is bringing. And if we talk about writing for an expert audience or a layperson audience, for example, like that, an individual layperson in the audience may be bringing a completely different set of interpretive tools and experiences to the table than someone else. And it's kind of like there's no one size fits all. But I think if the work speaks to a lot of different people on a lot of different levels and in different ways, and provides opportunities for entry into the work for different kinds of people, then that's really the ideal. That's the dream as far as I'm concerned. So I want work that, is intellectually stimulating and has musical integrity and substance, but can also be meaningful for people who don't necessarily have musical training. And I really love listening to work that also works on multiple levels. So that's kind of, I think, what I aspire to, and hopefully I'm able to achieve that at moments.
Yeah, I agree. That is, I think that is kind of the goal a lot of us have. Um, I know you've also done a lot of artist residencies. You go out into somewhere and you're isolated for a certain amount of time, or maybe you're with fellow artists. Um, and I bring this up because you talk about the experience of place as being important in your process. And so I wonder, like, what's the advantage for you of doing these kind of residencies in terms of your actual process of composing, and how does that experience interact with what you're doing as a creative person?
Yeah, so I've done 2 residency programs, the Helene Wurlitzer Foundation of New Mexico, which I've actually done 3 times, and then the Brush Creek Foundation for the Arts, which I did once a few years ago, and they sadly just ended the program, which is really
Oh, I forget.
unfortunate. Yeah, they just closed the program.
Oh, that's too bad.
Yeah, it was really an incredible experience being there, and I think different residencies offer different benefits to me, but as a place inspired composer, more often than not, the actual process of making music is disconnected from my immediate experience of the place. So I'll kind of go out, you know, do information gathering or inspiration gathering and kind of bring that back to the studio and evolve a piece from there. And in the case of these residencies, I was able to do more immersive in situ work, which is, really rewarding. And I think it's just a kind of luxury that I don't often get to have when I'm thinking about, because I live in an urban environment and there's obviously tons of inspiration to be had from New York City. But when I want to look to a wilderness environment, I have to, go out. So I think with the Brush Creek residency, I actually used it as an opportunity to experiment with a completely different way of composing, where I was out on the trail with my little notebook, like writing music or recording melodies that I'm singing into a recorder, and trying to incorporate music making into walking and into being in the environment as much as possible. And I wrote a solo piano piece out of that experience over about 2 weeks. So that was a great opportunity, and I was really happy with what came out of it, but it was definitely not like my normal way of making. So, and then the New Mexico residencies were really great because I was actually composing an opera that was set in New Mexico. So I was able to have a kind of immersive experience where I would be able to go visit sites where events in the opera took place, bring that back to my studio, and have this very kind of immediate experience.
That's really cool. That reminds me of like what all the animators do, right? Like Hayao Miyazaki does that, in his films, right? He'll go to a certain location and like spend time there or whatnot, and so that he can pick up the vibe of the place and yeah, get inspired by what he's actually writing about.
That's
Um,
wonderful.
yeah, it's great. Uh, how does the crisis of climate change influence your ideas about music making and the music you write? So you mentioned the idea of drawing attention to issues.
Mm-hmm.
There's also the notion of exploring something more complex, or maybe some of our guests have talked about the idea of like, it's so stressful, I separate myself from it when I'm doing creative work. So I think there's a lot of different answers to that. So I wonder, like, it's something we can't ignore for sure, but how does that play into your uh, music or your creative process?
Yeah. Um, so I have like a couple of broader thoughts about composer as activist or as a citizen, and then I have some specific thoughts about climate change. Would you like me to kind of go more in depth to climate change, or take the broader
Whatever you like.
question?
Whatever
Cool.
you like to talk about.
Well, I actually like saved a couple quotations that I'd come across that I thought might be really interesting for our conversation. If you don't mind me reading them. The first is from an article called Rewriting the Future Using Science Fiction to Re-Envision Justice by the author and scholar Walida Imarisha. And she's writing on the importance that fiction writers have in social justice, but I feel like what she has to say can teach us something about composers and the environment and climate change and all of that. And her quotation from her article is, "This is precisely why we need science fiction. It allows us to imagine possibilities outside of what exists today. The only way we know we can challenge the divine right of kings is by being able to imagine a world where kings no longer rule us or do not even exist. When we free our imaginations, we question everything. That is why decolonization of the imagination is the most dangerous and subversive decolonization process of all," which I thought was such an amazing sentiment. And I also want to read a quotation from the dramaturg and director, Ben Crywatts, who I had the pleasure of studying with. This is from his essay, Soul Workers. And I'm going to paraphrase slightly. He says, "In a healthy, functioning society, we have many different kinds of service providers. Soul workers are the psychologists, ministers, and especially the artists who work with the intangibles of human interaction. If artists have anything in common, it is our ability to provide experiences and objects that touch audiences in a way that can't be rationally articulated." And I love Ben's idea of the artist as soul worker, and that being an intrinsically meaningful part of society. And so these are all kinds of ideas that I'm bouncing around in my head. And I think although music is inherently different from something like science fiction writing or documentary filmmaking, for example, to me, music is, for me personally, a form of storytelling and a form of communication. And I think that composers have the ability to expand people's imaginations by helping them to access the kinds of emotional and spiritual experiences that are particularly facilitated by listening to music. And if our music is tied to stories about the world around us and our own value systems, then that becomes all the more powerful. And I think that we take on roles of being public intellectuals or advocates and educators. So in those capacities, we, through our work and our presence in society, can draw people's attention to ideas and issues that we care about. So I think that applies to anything concrete, like the Wild and Scenic Rivers Acts, which we'll talk about later, or something more intangible, like a value system that says that wildlife has an intrinsic right to exist or something. So, this is all kind of imaginative work that we as composers, as artists can do. And it doesn't necessarily have to take the form of very kind of, literal activism, but it can be a part and parcel of what we do as artists and as soul workers in helping our public, our audience, whoever that may be, kind of expand their vision of the world and what they care about and what's possible. And I think it's just really intrinsically impactful and also intrinsically subversive for us to invest our energies and our audience's energies in all of these ideas and values that are so marginalized by capitalism. So that's like a very broad kind of, yeah, thank you. But so that's how I feel. But I think that, artists can also, above and beyond their work as musicians or artists, do activism and advocacy. And I think that that's all incredibly necessary for enacting change. So to me, the question of what you do as a composer and what you do as a person is complementary. And you don't necessarily have to do everything that you want to do as a person under the guise of being a composer, if that makes sense.
I think that makes a lot of sense. I think that's very well put. And I think, that's a very healthy way to look at it too. Like, it's just because I'm a composer doesn't mean I need to express every tiny little thought or opinion that I have into a piece of music. Like, I can express those thoughts at a demonstration or, writing to my local politicians or conversations with friends. But also, making creative work is very subversive in a capitalist society. And also this idea of imagination too is so important. So important, especially now, like when we're, under lockdown and, we're kind of opening our eyes as a society to the brutality against Black people that is going on and has been going on in the US. And, the problem of climate change, all these things are like, these are problems in our normal society that were not acceptable. And so something that art can do, which may not on the surface sound like activism, and yet it is to not draw attention, but to think of alternative ways we need imagination, and we need people to think of something different, because that's really difficult. And it's
Yeah.
difficult for people to see something different. And I think art is one of the most effective ways to show people, hey, there's a different way of living in the world, a different way of going about life than what we've always done, because what we've always done kind of sucks. So that's very beautiful, inspiring.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking to your question about climate change in particular, I think this is something that's definitely an ongoing question for me, of how to bring climate change into my work. And I've been thinking that maybe it's not a question of so much how to make individual works of music that respond to climate change, but how do we bring an awareness of climate change into any work? So that's just an open question that I haven't resolved for myself. But I am in the very early nascent stages of developing a song cycle that looks at climate change from the perspective of 3 different characters. And each of these characters represents the past, present, and future of our climate. And I really like the idea of looking at climate change from a very human perspective, and making this really big, overwhelming topic more tangible and emotionally accessible, and help us to understand it by bringing it to the human scale. So that's kind of a direction that I'm hoping to get to work in.
Yeah, I think that's kind of an angle that I'm personally interested in myself too, is like and I think it's something that artists can also help with, is like, these are big issues, that are really difficult for people to wrap their head around, so much so that we have a lot of denial as well. That's another response that you see, right? And so I think these kind of artworks that explore something in a nuanced way, instead of just, like an op-ed, which can be nice, but I think, yeah, to explore something and help us grapple with it intellectually, and just spend some time sitting with it. It takes a long time to figure these things out. It's not something you just, boom, you finish in a week or something. It takes years.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I feel like any work that presents a really challenging subject matter has to invite the audience in, and allow them entry into the subject matter emotionally. And so that's what I'm really interested in seeing. Yeah.
And that's part of, in a way, like you mentioned, how it's maybe more obvious how fiction can relate to these things than like music, which is much more abstract. But I think the abstractness is actually a strength that music has too. And it's because of its kind of slipperiness, we can also we can interact with it in a different way that's very unique to the listener.
Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe this would be a good time to talk about landscape music.
Sure.
So tell me about landscape music. I mean, I know a little bit about it already, but when did you get this project started, and what inspired you to do it?
Yeah, well, I founded Landscape Music in 2015, and it was initially just an online publication, but I quickly expanded it to become a composers network. And we currently have about 26 members. And our mission is to deepen public appreciation of the natural world by providing a platform for contemporary composers whose music engages with landscape, nature, and place. So I think the idea for this started when I was very interested in making work along these lines, and interested in exploring the work of others, because I had sort of noticed that this was, if not a movement per se, it was certainly bubbling up in the zeitgeist. And there's a long historical tradition of music inspired by nature. It's almost as old as music itself. It's inherent to the musical experience in any culture. But I think the particular phenomenon of contemporary composers looking to landscape for inspiration and interpreting it through music was something that I really wanted to engage with and identify as a thread of music making unto itself, to be distinguished and recognized and appreciated, and perhaps developed through the creation of some kind of platform or community. So that's really what was my impetus behind landscape music.
Could you tell us about some of the projects that's done? The maybe the Rivers and Trails project, which was a big undertaking that had numerous concerts result around the country. Maybe talk about that project a little bit.
For sure. Yeah. So landscape music does work kind of in a few different threads. One is just the online platform itself and as the curatorial platform. We also, publish essays and interviews on the website. But then perhaps the most impactful arm of what we do is partnering with performers, ensembles, organizations, government agencies, environmental organizations to create events that bring the music of Landscape Music Composers Network to a public. And so with Rivers and Trails, that was really our most ambitious performing program to date. That was a nationwide series of concerts in fall of 2018. And it was coordinated by several members of the Composers Network. There were 5 different concerts in different locations. It was Boston, the Bay Area, Michigan, Atlanta, and Portland. And together we were able to co-premiere 12 new works of pieces, 12 new works of music, which were all responding to the Wild and Scenic Rivers and National Trails System Act. So 2018 was the 50th anniversary of the passage of these 2 acts, and we really wanted to have a thematic focus for this concert series that would really tie all these works together and help audiences to engage with something that they may not be super familiar with. And I know I wasn't at the beginning of the project. We had post-concert audience surveys that we did to kind of get a sense of who was coming and how the concerts affected their understanding of National Trails System and the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. And it seems like there was a really huge direct impact on people attending and gaining familiarity with these acts. So the sort of public education component, I feel like, was pretty successful in that regard. And we also saw in the surveys that a lot of attendees were not necessarily seasoned concert goers of contemporary chamber music, and all of the works on these concerts were by living composers, instrumental chamber music. And there was a really positive response to how this music was facilitating people's appreciation of the landscapes. So I think that being able to speak to a non-specialist audience was one of the really big benefits of doing that project.
That's great. And that the Rivers and Trails, that's something that's kind of like maybe underrated in a way. Like, because the piece that I wrote was a piano piece inspired by the American River, which like I grew up next to and I, went there a lot. And it's like, it's something you can take for granted that seems very small and local, but it's so important because every community needs some kind of access to nature like that, I think. So
absolutely.
That's really big.
And conservation and preservation happens on all levels, and it's important on all levels. And I think national parks, rightfully get a lot of attention, but there's all these other forms of conservation and preservation that are, often multi-agency efforts, not only the National Park Service. And, my piece was inspired by the Juan Bautista de Anza National Historic Trail, which is not what people think of when they think of a trail. It's more like a narrative that's imposed onto the map that's tracing the history of this Spanish colonial expedition and the indigenous people who are involved in making that possible. So it's really more a historical and cultural preservation effort and a public and local education effort than it is about, large tracts of wilderness. So I think it was really interesting. Trails and rivers were a really interesting point of entry into aspects of conservation and preservation that aren't always at the front of people's minds, perhaps in the public imagination.
For sure. And there's another 50th anniversary this year, which is the anniversary of Earth Year, or Earth Day, I should say. And I think this year was supposed to be like a big year for climate activism. There are other kinds of activism happening now, which is very extremely important and also interconnected with that in a way. But there were huge protests last year drawing attention to climate change, and this year is a big year for that. And Landscape Music now has the Earth Year initiative, and this series is part of that initiative as well. This YouTube series. So could you talk about, this is much different from the Rivers and Trails project, but could you talk about this initiative a little bit and maybe sample some of the activities that various composers are doing?
Sure. Earth Year 2020 is an initiative that I started for this year, and it's really an opportunity for us to highlight more of a cross section of what the different members of Landscape Music Composers Network are doing in different forms. Rivers and Trails was really focused on live chamber music, which is wonderful, but I wanted to do something that could encompass a more varied portfolio of creative activities. So it's, you know, activities are taking place throughout this year, and thankfully before COVID, a lot of these things were already planned to be digital, remote, asynchronous events. So we weren't having to cancel, you know, most of what we were doing. And we're looking at postponing the live performance elements of Earth Year. But it's really just a catalyst for new works, music videos, community events, engaging, broadly speaking, music that reflects environmental themes at the forefront of our global consciousness, and leaving that really open-ended to the composer's interpretations of what they feel is most important. So yeah, we have you know, this series, an interview series, music videos and short films by some of our members. One member is doing a consortium commission for a concert band piece. Another composer is doing 2 artist residencies that will inform chamber works and the postponed performance projects, one of which we're collaborating on.
Right, City Water, which was
with City Water, your prior guest.
Interviewed, yeah.
Yeah, so we have a complete list of all of these on landscapemusic.org, and some of the virtual projects are, yeah, and some of the virtual projects are available for viewing now, and they'll be added to over the course of the year. So yeah, that's, you know, responding to the 50th anniversary of Earth Day as another demarcation of time and a reason to, you know, bring these things to the forefront.
Right, that's great. Yeah, go and check it out. There are some very interesting projects happening and will be happening hopefully next year also. Could you tell us a little bit about your piece that you sent me from, you have a movement from a piano trio called Transforming Forest, and you've sent the last movement Obscuring. So maybe you could tell us a little, this is a very place-inspired piece also. So tell us a little bit about this piece and maybe the last movement in particular before we listen to it.
Sure. Yeah, Transforming Forest was commissioned by Montage Music Society based in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And it's inspired by 4 site-specific installations created by the land artist Andy Goldsworthy. And these installations were made in the Presidio of San Francisco, which is actually really close to where I grew up. I grew up just outside the Presidio. So these sites are kind of like childhood landscapes for me, but these installations were created later on after I left the area. But I've gone back often and visited many times and have always wanted to do something in response to these works, which I think are just astonishing. And the title comes from the idea of transformation being really the common thread through each of Goldsworthy's installations. And the 4th movement responds to his work Spire, in which he took different trunks of felled Monterey cypress trees and created a 100-foot sculpture that creates a big spire jutting up into the sky. And they had just cleared forest and were replacing it with Monterey cypress trees, young trees. And so the idea is that over the course of many years and decades, these fledgling trees will grow up and overtake the 100-foot sculpture and obscure it over time. So I wanted to create a piece of music that reflected this kind of transformation. And in the piece, there's really 2 primary kinds of musical material. There's this climbing gesture in the piano juxtaposed with sustained notes in the strings. And that is meant to evoke the kind of sense of spaciousness and scale and upward thrust of the place, as well as its very kind of meditative, almost spiritual quality. And the other kind of music is this very tender, quiet triplet material, which represents these young cypress trees, and the stand of trees gradually overtake the spire over the course of this short piece.
Great. Okay, let's listen to that now. Very beautiful.
Thank you.
Very this especially the introduction to that. There's like this space and silence and like slow. There's a slowness to it that is really nice. Is that something that's is maybe related to this idea of time? Because the sculpture, which I didn't realize until you just told me now, like it's a time sculpture too, because it's has this idea like it's there, and then oh, these trees, they're gonna overtake it many years from now. Um, so yeah,
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah, all of Goldsworthy's installations in the Presidio are ephemeral in some way and transform over time. And I think it's a really impactful reflection of the ephemerality of life and certainly of our environment and, you know, the imprint that we put upon it.
Right, because music is ephemeral in a very obvious way, but but physical sculptures and art pieces, those are changing in time as well and disappear also.
Yeah, yeah. And definitely I used a lot of negative space in that piece. And I feel like it was definitely just in response to the character of the place as I felt it and the sense of um, open sky and it being kind of encroached upon by the trees and having these two planes and these openings, you know, in the context of this forest clearing, the sky is almost like a window. And so there's these windows of silence within the music.
Great. Um, is there anything else that you'd like to say that I haven't asked you about, whether this piece or anything in our conversation before?
Nothing in particular, I guess. I just thank you for, including me in this interview series, and, bravo for picking a really awesome slate of people to interview. I've been enjoying your other conversations.
Oh, good. Thanks. Thanks. Yeah, they've been really interesting. Well, thanks so much for doing this. It's really nice to talk to you, and yeah, a lot of great stuff to think about.
Likewise.
All
Yeah.
right. Take care. I'll see you soon.
Take care. See ya.